Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our first day grounded, staying at home and sane when you're inside. So over this week till Friday, we'll be talking about a lot of mental health and self-care professionals, how to manage and make the most out of this time while you're inside, and really some tools to kind of take away and process to grow for the future. So today I have the pleasure of interviewing Cher Anderton. She's a mental health therapist and trauma-informed consultant. And I think it was over the summer, I had the pleasure of taking Cher's course Shift, which is how to rewire your brain for growth and healing. And that was immensely beneficial. So she's going to be talking a little bit about those tips and tricks today. So thanks for joining us today, Cher. How are you?
I'm okay. I'm good. It's Monday. The sun's out in Seattle, which always means a good day here. So I'll take it.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah, I'm in Massachusetts at the moment. We have a little bit of rain, but the weekend was okay, so I can't complain too much.
Yeah,
But
the weather helps right now. That's for sure if it's good.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just wanted to dive right in. So obviously, like, there's an elephant in the room. We're facing this pandemic. I wanted to know specifically, what your biggest truth is at the time. How are you handling, what's going on? What do you notice from other people? Like, what's really like speaking to you at the moment from your point of view?
Yeah. So, we're quite a bit into this now. So I feel like some of the kind of roller coaster of emotions have settled a bit and I'm kind of adapting a little bit better. I know that there's been a lot of kind of keep calm during COVID kind of resources out there, and some of it can be really, really helpful. And it can also be pretty overwhelming. So one of the things that I've seen and really encouraged, especially in clients and that sort of thing, is to really give yourself space to move through this in a way that feels good to you, with all those resources coming in, even with this, that we're presenting today. Take what feels like it's going to be helpful for you and work for you, and then leave the rest. There's no real right way to do this or anything. It's just right for you. So that's something that's been kind of important for me to kind of keep in mind as well when I'm taking in a bunch of information. And then also reminding myself and others that we won't always feel this way, that it's not always going to be this way, that we're going to adapt and figure out, because that's our, one of our human superpowers is to adapt to things. And then one of the other things that's really come to mind for me is that, we have a lot of choice in this. It may not feel that way because there's all these restrictions and things that we're told to do or to not do. But we really do have a lot of choice in, we have opportunities to deepen connection with people, right, in different ways, even if you're not kind of quarantining with family or friends or whatever it is. There's lots of different ways to deepen connection. There's opportunities to heal negative patterns. There's some things that have shown up for me during this time that I'm like, oh, maybe some of these skills that I thought I really had down, not so much when I'm faced with something like this. And so focusing on healing those patterns and then really growing my skill set in a different way. I realized I had been relying on a lot of things externally to kind of move through life and feel good. And so this has been an opportunity for me to really, really be self-reflective and say, okay, I've got some other things I could pay attention to. So,
Yeah, for sure. I really like that. Yeah, something as I'm going through all of this, I'm noticing my truth isn't exactly the same truth as everyone else's. And so like, whatever I offer doesn't necessarily mean it's true for somebody else. So, but it doesn't mean that, if we have these tools that are presented to us that they can't be used at a later date, but there's no need to shame yourself or feel bad about, the fact that like, I can't get this down right now. It's just like, this perfect. Just put it in your tool belt and go along your way. That's okay. Yeah, and I think definitely for the same thing for me, this has all been a giant mirror to the fact I'm like, I've made a lot of progress, but there's still further to go. And this is a giant like magnifying glass for this. So to embrace that with kind of a curiosity rather than just an anger towards it or like, why is this showing up? So yeah, I like it. So that.
Or just ignoring it and kind of numbing out with other things like checking out and distracting ourselves with with lots of different things. And we can kind of talk about that later when we talk about feel good plans, but it's uncomfortable sometimes to look inward, right? It can be, because it's like, oh, I'm noticing things that I need to pay attention to and maybe heal and grow, but it's so worth the effort and that introspection on the other side. It gets easier and easier the more you do it. And it's really, really worthwhile to go inward instead of trying to navigate and feel better by, you know, distracting or manipulating our environment in a way that is less helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I always say if you're going to avoid this now in some way, it'll just come back for you eventually later. So you can't really run away from it. So
yeah, and it usually comes back worse.
Right, exactly. Yeah, multiplied.
You don't keep taking these, if you don't accept these invitations, I just feel like they get louder and louder and more uncomfortable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so perfect. With that, I just kind of wanted to dive into how you talk about how our brain reacts to fear. Because, you know, I really like, when I was going through a course, the scientific standpoint of how we will embrace fear and why we're doing it from an evolutionary standpoint. It has its purpose. It's showing us something. And to again, as I said, embrace it with curiosity rather than just a reaction. So are you able to talk about how the brain works for that? So.
Yeah, absolutely. There's 3 parts of the brain that I think it's really important for each of us to know about ourselves and even about others. And especially if you're a parent, it's great to know this about your kids because they're so externalizing with their emotions. It can be really helpful, but the first part is your amygdala. Your amygdala has 2 really important jobs. It's in charge of your psychological safety and your physical safety. So it's like your security guard, and that's was real handy back in kind of more primitive times when we really had to be on guard. And it is handy now too in cases of physical safety. But it can also be wired to react with a perception of a threat. And that's where we can get, it can get kind of tricky. And right now we have both kind of what feels like psychological threat and physical threat, with the virus as the physical threat, right? And then the psychological threat is just all of the fear and kind of sensationalizing and just uncertainty that can really mess our brains up. Our brains do not like uncertainty very much. And so it can kind of trigger that amygdala. And when we have our amygdala triggered, we react in one of 4 ways. We've got that fight, right? Where we're ready to just kind of react to it. We flight, which is to run, or we freeze. Or fawn, which is a newly researched one, which means to kind of befriend the threat. Now, behaviors that go along with that, freezing can look like just kind of shutting down, isolating yourself. The running away just means like we're going to try and escape and just binge watch Netflix, or really just kind of distract and check out, maybe even drinking or whatever it is, using substances to kind of escape. And then fighting just means we're very reactionary, irritable, that sort of thing. So those things I think we could all kind of recognize in ourselves are happening right now. So our amygdala is in our feelings part of our brain, right behind your ears. If you tickle kind of right behind there, that's where your amygdala are in your limbic system. And it really has important jobs, except we, again, sometimes get wired to be so reactionary that we need to have more strategies to soothe our nervous system and kind of let our brains know, hey, we're safe right now. It just feels kind of wonky, or we're afraid, and to have some strategies to soothe that nervous system so it's not constantly on high alert. Because when that happens, we get that stress response in our brain and our body. Now, adrenaline and cortisol, which are initiated when our amygdala reacts or gets triggered, are really helpful in small doses here and there. But lots of it over time can have real negative effects on our bodies. And so we want to be really skilled in having tools to manage the stress and the overwhelm that we're feeling right now. Next to the amygdala is the hippocampus, which is our memory saver. So our hippocampus really kind of feeds the amygdala's response. They're talking to each other all the time. They're right next to each other in the limbic system. And then the other part of the brain, actually real quick, I'm going to say something about the hippocampus. The hippocampus is interesting because it doesn't actually remember things necessarily how they happened. it remembers how you interpret them. So there's a lot of kind of, misperceptions and misinterpretations that we can have because of our wiring, and that gets stored in our hippocampus. Those stories are fed to our amygdala, and that can lead to kind of those reactions. So really focusing on our stories and the language we're using can be helpful in that way. And then our prefrontal cortex, it's our forehead, right behind our forehead. It's our thinking part of our brain. We want it engaged as much as possible. These parts of the brain, the thinking and the feeling part, they're communicating all the time until they're not. When the amygdala is really triggered, it's going to cut off access to that prefrontal cortex. And that's when we can typically say and do things that either one, are going to keep us really safe, which is good, or two, create a lot of disconnection. We're going to say and do from our amygdalas with those strong emotions when there really isn't a physical threat. That can be a problem in relationships and for ourselves. So it's just good to know what's happening. Like, oh, I'm in my amygdala, I'm having really strong, uncomfortable emotions, checking in with what your stories are, and then really working to soothe your nervous system to get that prefrontal cortex engaged, to kind of talk us down. That's what the prefrontal cortex's job is, to help us regulate those emotions by kind of talking us down from them.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that I like having, the fact that, there's parts of the brain that are really centered towards fear, and it's so we have an incredible amount of fear bias because, like you said, that's a part where that's trying to keep us safe. So with that in mind, you really, and the fact that the hippocampus is kind of working to create memories that are keeping you also safe. You really want to, we wants to create this memory. It's like, remember that happened last time, don't do that again. Yes. So yeah, it takes a lot of, really examining and looking at that stuff. So knowing what we know about the brain right now, how can we kind of soothe those parts and kind of redirect that in a way that tells it that it's safe and,
So I think, it always starts with self-awareness. We have to be able to identify what's happening in our brains and our bodies, be able to notice it. That's the first step always in kind of shifting. And then we need to have strategies that can help us. We need to be able to be practicing the steps for healthy emotional processing. And they're pretty simple steps, and we'll go over them today. Yet we're just really not explicitly taught. I mean, none of us really have this formal education about how to process emotions in healthy ways, yet it's foundational to our mental and physical well-being, because we know that the mind and the body are talking to each other all the time. And so it's really important to practice these steps. And if this is an area of growth for you, which is an area of growth for all of us, I've been really explicitly practicing these, helping my kids practice them, because we need this really more than ever. And taking this time to build our social emotional kind of toolkit, build our emotional intelligence, is a really good use of our time right now, so that when we can kind of move out and about in the world, we've become more skilled and can navigate it in an even better way. So some of the strategies, and just thinking again, we really don't have much of a formal education on this, yet we're taught how to, tie our shoes as kids. We're taught how to ride a bike without training wheels, or drive a car, or, swim the crawl stroke, whatever it is. We're taught all of these steps to these really important life skills, but not necessarily the healthy emotional processing. So it's something that I'm really passionate about sharing with everybody. They're very simple, but it's really, really important. They're not necessarily easy to practice. So I hope everybody has paper and pen when they're watching this to write down the steps. Do you want me to just dive in and start sharing steps? Is that helpful? Okay, good. Okay, so this is, again, something that you might be practicing already, but you want to be more intentional about doing it, not just doing it on autopilot. Especially if you have kids, you want to be thinking aloud and modeling and teaching them how to do these steps as well. So the first step in healthy emotional processing is just to pause. This is the part where you get to create that self-awareness and notice what's happening. So when you're experiencing something that makes you feel uncomfortable, you start noticing the discomfort, you're feeling frustrated, rejected, sad, whatever it is, you're going to just pause and take a couple deep breaths and check in with yourself. Having that pause button installed in your nervous system is really key, because you want to move, we want to be moving from reaction to responding wisely. Reaction is what we want our amygdala to do in an instance of safety. We want it to just, have our brain and body do the thing to keep us safe. But when our emotions are triggered in that same part of the brain, we don't want to be reacting from that space. We want to be able to stop, pause, check in. So that's the first step, to just really notice what's going on. And then the second step is to name it, to tame it, meaning we need to actually identify our emotions, because our brain has sends us signals through emotions. And if we don't pick up what it's putting down, it's going to keep intensifying that emotion. So if I'm stressed and overwhelmed and I'm just really not checking in with myself, my brain's trying to say, hey, what you're doing is too much, or whatever it is, it's trying to give me a signal to pay attention to. If I keep ignoring it, I'm going to become more and more overwhelmed and stressed. It's going to keep intensifying it till I start paying attention to it. And that can come in pretty uncomfortable ways. We've probably all experienced that before. And so we want to identify our emotions. There's even been studies to show that as adults, we are not very good at it. We don't have a very broad vocabulary of identifying emotions. We kind of stick with the same 3 to 5 emotions when, there's dozens and dozens of them. So really, even when you're not uncomfortable, I recommend, if this is something that you'd like to practice, I recommend folks like just setting 3 times a day where they just check in with themselves and ask themselves how they're feeling. Oh, I feel really happy and content right now. Oh, I'm sad and frustrated right now. And then you rate those feelings on a scale of 1 to 10 of intensity. I'm happy at an 8, which is really intense happiness, or I'm sad at a 4, which is kind of medium sadness, right? So just kind of really getting tuning into yourself is a really fantastic skill to build our emotional intelligence. And so first we're pausing so we don't react. Then we're naming it to tame it. And then we're going to move into some strategies that help us soothe our nervous system and train it to calm down. So I call this a feel-good plan. You can call it a bliss list. You can call it whatever you want, but it's essentially a list of things that you think, say, and do to soothe your nervous system. And there are 3 things that I think should be on everybody's feel-good plan. One is deep breaths, because when our amygdalas are triggered, our bodies actually send oxygen out to our extremities, our hands and our arms and our legs, so we can do that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn thing. So we have to be really intentional about bringing breath back to center and back to our brain so we can kind of get our thinking brain back online. So having a breath practice is really, really important. And there's tons out there. I mean, do you have like a breath practice that there's like square breathing and rainbow breaths, whatever it is. Is there something that you use, Lauren, that?
Yeah, I tend to use the Ujjayi breath, which is from yoga. It's a very loud kind of, you can hear it in the back of your throat. So the fact that it's so loud, like, really makes it so there's nothing else you can focus on, because you're really aware of it. So
Got it. That's the breath that I always have a hard time. They're like, do it in the back of your throat. I'm like, I need to practice that one. That's good. Yeah. When there's a sound with it, that is just kind of like, that's all you can focus on, because you're using kind of lots of different senses there. That's a good idea. That's great. There's all kinds of breath practices out there. But I highly recommend really focusing on that, because that's going to be something that you can use anytime, anywhere, to help you pause and to soothe your nervous system. Because we always have our lungs with us, which is important. The second thing that I think should be on everybody's list is movement. There's just so much science out there to say that our brains and bodies need movement in order to feel good. We're wired to need it. And so any type of movement, it could be hula hooping, walking, yoga, and dancing in your kitchen, whatever it is, as long as you're moving your body regularly throughout the day in some form that feels good to you, not like I have to do this, but I want to just do something fun and move my body, is really important. And then the final thing that should be on everybody's list is helpful self-talk. So it's in that self-talk that we either make mountains out of molehills or molehills out of mountains. So if we're focused on, if our self-talk right now is, I can't handle this is too much, we've got all these kind of worry narratives going through our minds about what's going to happen to us or our loved ones, just all of that stuff, which can be true, yes. But we know we get more of what we pay attention to. And so if we're going to just really focus our self-talk on all of the things that could go wrong, or are going wrong, we're just going to get more of that, and we're going to get more and more overwhelmed. That's kind of the paradox of life. I think it's just that there's beautiful things happening at the same time as really horrible things. Right. So we get to really use that superpower, which is our other superpower. The adaptability is one of them. The second one is mastering our thoughts and being able to really choose the thoughts that we allow to take up space, take up residence. We have thoughts that come in from all different places, but are you going to entertain it and like sit in the soup of it? Or are you going to use that superpower and kind of shift it to something that's more helpful for you? And so I highly recommend using a strategy called a cognitive behavioral thought triangle. And so you can Google it. There's lots of videos that are really great videos that explain what a CBT triangle can do for you. But essentially, if you look at, a triangle, at the top, it's thoughts. And then on the bottom right, it's feelings. And the bottom left, it's behavior. And it's really just a visual to say our thoughts affect our feelings, affect our behavior. Behavior affects thoughts and feelings. They're all interconnected. So if I think I can't handle this, this is horrible being stuck in a house with my family, whatever it is, or I can't go out, whatever, I'm going to start feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, sad, anxious, disappointed, all kinds of really uncomfortable emotions. And then what I might say and do with those uncomfortable emotions are, isolate myself, or just check out and just watch screens the whole time, or not, eat well, or whatever it is. My behavior and the things that I say may not be that great. And so instead I could say, one thing to really keep in mind with CBT triangles is we're not talking about like rainbow and unicorn thoughts. We're not saying like, this is so great, I'm home with my family all the time. Your brain's going to call BS on that real quick. You need to be realistic and hopeful. So this is really hard and I can handle it. Or this is really hard and these are the things I'm going to choose to do instead of focusing on what's so hard. Then I'm going to start feeling better and saying and doing better. And there's lots, we could talk about the CBT triangle for a long time, but just as far as self-talk goes, that's one of the most helpful strategies. So you can ask yourself, what's my thought triangle right now? If you notice discomfort, check in. What kind of story am I telling myself? What's my thought triangle? And can it be more helpful? And then taking the time to come up with a realistic and more hopeful thought can shift those feelings big time and really soothe the nervous system. So
yeah, for sure. It's really baffling how many just distorted thought. We'll have an emotion and we'll just kind of take that emotion as fact, first of all, which is a hard, kind of nuanced thing because we want our emotions to direct us, but we have to realize like why, the emotion is existing at this current time. And a lot of times it's like, maybe we have some faulty information and that's like not fueling the emotion the way we want it to. And I really think that, the CBT triangle has really helped me break that down and actually putting it on paper, because just seeing it, I think you said it's like a rehearsal for your brain. You know how to start like reframing this in a different direction. Yeah. And I think especially, it trains your brain to start noticing these things. It trains your brain to recognize you're not always what you think you are. So
yeah, no, super, very true. I highly recommend writing them down in the beginning just to kind of get the hang of it. And then over time, you can just start in your mind with your self-talk, asking yourself, what's my thought triangle, kind of working, oh, it's this, that's why I'm feeling that. And, ideally, we want to catch ourselves before we get to the saying and doing part, because that's when we're potentially going to create disconnection with others and with ourselves, right? We're going to behave in a way that doesn't align with really how we want to show up. And keeping in mind the realistic and hopeful piece, you know, if there are a bunch of emotions lined up at the amygdala, like, as you know, we can feel a lot of emotions at the same time, yet if fear is there, it's going to trump all other emotions except hope. If hope hops in there, it's going to kick fear out. Fear and hope cannot exist at the same time in our brains. And so really focusing on the realistic piece, just because you want to validate your experience that you're having, it's really important to do that. We just don't want to sit in the soup of it. And so that's where the hopeful piece comes in. And so it's a great strategy. Just draw a triangle, put your thought at the top, put your feeling there, your feelings, and then what you potentially might say or do or did say and do. And then see how you can rework the triangle with a more realistic and hopeful thought, and see how that shifts, how you feel differently and how you say and do differently. And again, lots of great videos on YouTube. If you just put in CBT triangle, if you want to dive into that a little bit more, that can be helpful.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
Something that I really like nowadays that I try to recognize is that even fear is serving us. It wouldn't exist if it didn't have a purpose. So the fact that like it is trying to serve you, you can really reframe it in that direction of like, this fear is serving me because it's trying to keep me safe. That is coming from a place of love, really. So really reframing that, and then you realize that basically everything you do is based in love. So how can you, knowing that, it really puts you in a different kind of spot rather than shaming yourself for the fear, feeling bad that you're feeling it. So
we never want to shaming is really unhelpful in that space. You can recognize that, yes, this is coming from a space of love and trying to protect us, and at the same time know that your brain is really you can shift it away from that. You can train it to not be so reactionary in fear. It's there to serve a purpose, yet it can kind of show up a bit too often sometimes, right? That's when our nervous systems really get overwhelmed and get that kind of wear and tear that is less helpful. So yes, it's helpful at a certain space. You can honor that. Hey, thanks for trying to help me out, brain. But guess what? This is what we're going to pay attention to now. That's not shaming. That's just saying, hey, I got you. I see you. And we're going to move to a different space because I want to train my brain to be focused on other things instead.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so those are the three things: are deep breaths, helpful self-talk, and movement. And then there are two things that shouldn't be on anybody's feel-good plan. Those are vices. So I really love wine, but I'm not going to put wine on my feel-good plan, because your feel-good plan is supposed to be something that you go to often, right? It's a go-to, lots of strategies that you can use almost anytime, anywhere. And when we put things like shopping and gambling and vices, other vices on there, that's going to be a lot less helpful. And then the second thing is screens. Now, there are some loopholes to that. Like if you use a Calm or a Headspace app or something like that, or there's some YouTube videos that are teaching you a skill like yoga or, meditation or mindfulness, that those skills you can use outside of the screen, meaning when you're not in front of it, great. We don't want to be turning to screens like video games and binge watching Netflix and scrolling through social media, because studies show that our brains are still way too active in those spaces. And if we're not already filtering what is coming into those spaces, it can be a lot less helpful and really kind of drag us down more than lifting us up and soothing our nervous system. So not having screens as a go-to, which, how often do we just pick up our phones and just to check out and distract ourselves? We do it all the time, but it's really not a helpful part of our feel-good plan.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily mean that, you shouldn't, you shouldn't once in a while watch Netflix or anything, but just having the intention behind it and making sure there's no autopilot. Look, I'm just doing this because I don't want to identify this emotion and therefore this isn't in its place. So really knowing, like, having the awareness, as you were saying, in every moment to go forward with the decisions that you're making.
Yeah. The TV is not, the screens aren't bad in and of themselves. It's just we don't want that to be the go-to autopilot, which so many of us have developed over the years with these phones that are so accessible. we're turning to that way more than we're turning to these other strategies. And just from, I'm a former elementary school counselor, and just seeing the shift in kids too. Like if you're a parent and you're giving your kid a screen to calm down and not have a tantrum in a grocery store or whatever, a restaurant, when they're at school, they're less skilled to navigate those uncomfortable emotions because we're not giving them screens in schools to soothe themselves. And so it really does kids a disservice to constantly have that be a strategy when they're stressed and overwhelmed, or we're stressed and overwhelmed. Here and there, great. Totally get that. Put your kid in front of a show if you're going to lose it, and go take care of yourself and use your feel-good plan and then circle back around. But in general, we don't want that to be a common thing, because it just doesn't teach kids the skills, and it just doesn't help us at all either.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's kind of the feel-good plan piece. And then the last part of healthy emotional processing is just noticing, once your nervous system is soothed, like, is there anything that you need to problem solve? Did you experience the discomfort because someone crossed a boundary? Because you're making choices that are out of alignment with what you value and what your beliefs are? What is it that you need to pay attention to? What's the I use the word residue often, like what's left over that you need to pay attention to, that you can use this part of your brain now because you've soothed your nervous system enough. Now, the feel-good plan is not meant to just make emotions go away 100%. Sometimes that happens, great. Other times you're still going to feel the emotion, but the edge is taken off. It's not so intense. You can gauge those emotions in the beginning. Oh, I'm a 10 out of anxiety. My feel-good plan helps me get to a 6 or a 7. You want to kind of gauge it and just take the edge off so that you can feel the less intensity, and be able to engage the part of your brain that you need to in order to navigate whatever situation made you uncomfortable in the first place.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's worth noting that, like, when you're responding to these things, if somebody is triggering you in a certain way, sometimes it's not even about them. It's about based on your old fears and your old stories that do come up. So the more times you're able to identify that and sit with that, the more times you're going to, use that for the future and be less reactive, I think, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I'm so glad you brought that up. It's the discomfort. It's really kind of hard initially to wrap your mind around this concept, because it's so clear sometimes that that there's something that this person is doing wrong and it's about them. It feels really clear. But when you really pause and check in with yourself, using that behavior more of as a mirror, and like, hey, where am I doing that? Where am I being unthoughtful? Why is that triggering me in that way? And it's usually mostly about us, and not necessarily. Now, at some point, yes, boundaries have to be set, and that's a really important piece of well-being too. But oftentimes it is about us and what we're experiencing internally.
Yeah, really good. Yeah. So really, it all comes back to the awareness, and then you're able to go through all these plans.
Yes. Yeah. And I think the more we're aware, that the more we know, the better we do. It really is. That's the first step. We've got to tune in more often to what's going on inside, as uncomfortable it can be, because sometimes our internal landscapes are pretty chaotic, or just not really a place we want to be because there's trauma there or other things going on that feel uncomfortable. But it's really worthwhile work to pay attention there, because on the other side of that, you're so much more skilled, and you can move through life in a way that feels so much better to you and to the people that you're in relationship with.
Yeah, it's really important. Yeah, I like that. When you know better, you do better. So
yeah, that's a Maya Angelou quote. I can't claim that one for sure, but it's one of my favorites, because it's so true in any way, shape, or form. The more we know, but the more we know ourselves, definitely the better we do.
Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's all the time we have for today, but thank you so much. As I said, I was a part of Cher's program, Shift. So she has it on her page. It's called How to Rewire Your Brain for Growth, Healing, and Connection. And you can check out her website on sheranderton.com. So I'll put that in the comments. But
yeah, absolutely. There's also a free, if you go to my website, there's a pop-up window And if you just type in your email address, it'll send you, you'll get an email with a PDF on, like, if you're an educator, if that's your role, if you're just individual or a parent, a PDF on feel good plans and healthy emotional processing. And then also like a video tutorial that can be helpful. Redundancy is important in learning. So if you just kind of want to revisit that or have it in front of you on paper, that's a free resource there. And then, yeah, information about my courses, which the shift one is being revamped a bit. So the next time it's run, it's going to be a little bit different. And I think it gets better every time. So I'm glad that you were in that cohort. It was really, really fun group. So it's a great course. Yeah. So check it out. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks
Mm-hmm.
so much. Yeah, well, have a great day. Stay safe.
Yeah, you too. Take care.